right. Well, we're taking a break from our regular programming because I have not said anything particularly controversial for a few videos. So I'm going to talk about publishers today. Here's the deal, man. I've been saying for years that publishers generally don't know what they're doing and that it's an unsustainable business model and that it just doesn't work and that it doesn't make any sense. And man, I used to talk about this on occasion, and people would get super defensive. They'd be like, "No, what do you mean? The publishers, they like make the games a hit. They do the marketing, bro." But at this point, I feel like it's pretty undeniable that most publishers don't know what they're doing and that it's very unsustainable in the way that most people are signing these deals. Because we've got publishers left and right that are straight up going under, that are straight up going bankrupt, like big publishers that should know what they're doing, you would think, right? And so, yeah, we're just going to talk about it. There's a couple of scenarios in which I think publishers still do make sense, but so I'm going to talk about those. We'll get those out of the way first. The couple of scenarios when publishers are good, and I think it's a perfectly reasonable business decision. But we're also I want to talk about like why some people are so oddly in defense of publishers and all the reasons why I think the indie publishing scene is just, it doesn't make sense. The business model is flawed, and give you some personal stories from it as well. Primary way in which I think indie publishers are still a reasonable, logical business decision is if you were to work with a publisher to take a game that has already been released on PC and give them the console release rights or license, and specifically just give them, a publisher, the rights to release it on consoles. Okay, they don't get to touch PC. They're not funding PC. They're not getting revenue from PC. They fund and market and release on consoles. They get a revenue share off of consoles, and that's it. So I've self-published on all the major console platforms: Xbox, PlayStation, and Switch, and those platforms are still a pain to work with. They are a pain. The backend systems and everything is the most unintuitive mess that I have ever dealt with. So, is it possible? Yes, absolutely. If you really wanted to self-publish on consoles, you could, but it was more difficult than I was expecting. And if I could rewind the clock, if I could rewind time and go back to like 6 months before I released Choo Choo Charles on PC, what I would have done is I would try to find a publisher that was willing to take only the console license, right? Only license to release on consoles. They're not touching PC. They're not funding PC, okay? And then have them create a console release that would be simultaneous with the PC launch, okay? That's what I would have done if, knowing what I know now, if I could rewind the clock. Instead, what ended up happening is it came out on PC, it did well. Then I started looking at publishers that I could potentially partner with to put the game on consoles, and they were all saying like, "Oh yeah, give us like 40% of your revenue, give us 30% of your revenue," or whatever it might have been. I was thinking like, "Hey, how about like 10 or 20%?" I mean, even at that rate, it would have been plenty profitable for any of these companies. And then I also started looking at the just individual porting studios, because what a publisher does when they're porting, ultimately they just go to a porting studio. They say, "Hey, here's some source files that we just got from our developer. Go port this, and then come back when you're done." And that's it. They're essentially middlemaning, and then obviously they're also handling all of the ridiculous, overcomplicated backend stuff and setup and management with all the different platforms, because that stuff is very annoying. If you're able to get a deal where it's a very low rev share, maybe like 20% rev share in your favor, 20% for the publisher, and they just get access to consoles. They're not taking merch rights, they're not taking movie rights, they're not taking anything from PC, just that. That's a scenario that I think does make sense. Another scenario would be if the publisher has access to something very specific that you want that you do not have access to as a developer. Okay? That doesn't mean beta testing. That doesn't mean localization. You have access to that stuff. We're going to talk about that in just a second here. But if there's something very specific that a publisher can do for you that you know that would be very valuable, then maybe that could be worthwhile. I'm not going to talk about it a bunch because I'm pretty sure everything is still NDA. I have a deal with a publisher right now for a very specific thing that I think will be very useful, but it's a very small, very specific purpose. They're not getting rights to a bunch of other random stuff. And again, I'll probably talk about that more later on. But there are some odd specific scenarios here and there that do make sense as well. I think, hopefully, fingers crossed. And then the last scenario where I think getting a publisher is like really beneficial is if your game sucks. If you make a game, or if you get a publisher and you get them to give you like $250,000, like, oh, here's $100,000 or $200,000 or whatever, and then you go and you make an awful game that earns $20,000. Hey, you're getting the long end of the stick there. That's a good deal for you, I guess, because you got to spend a bunch of money and not pay it back. So, you know, if that's what you're into, that's fine. But ultimately, again, if your game sucks and you're not making back your recoup for the money that the publisher invested in you, then you're not making money anyways, right? Like maybe what you come out with, like, you know, sometimes, you know, you'll get recoups where it's like publishers recouping like 80% and you're recouping 20 until all of their expenses are recouped, right? So maybe you come out with like a couple bucks, but like at the end of the day, you're still not really making money. So that's basically a summary of like every scenario where I feel like publishers make the most sense. So why is it then that so many people, especially, it feels like it feels like most successful developers have a pretty rational view on publishers. They're like, okay, there are scenarios where it makes sense. There are scenarios where it doesn't. Or yes, I know I'm taking funding and I know that I'm giving up a lot of my revenue later on, but I've got a really specific vision for my game. And it's like, okay, if your goal is like really, really specific and you're not trying to make as much money as possible or something, or you're just like, you're working an awful, horrific day job and you just need nothing more than to get a little bit of funding so that you can stop and do game development full time or something, then it's like, okay, there are certain personal scenarios where, again, it's like there's not really anything that I could say. But it feels like a lot of amateur developers, they'll publish a really awful game or a handful of really awful games, and then they will blame their lack of a publisher for their unsuccessful products. They'll say, I see this all the time on Reddit, where people will be like doing their game post-mortem and they're like, so this is my game, and it looks awful, and I think it would have done really well if Devolver published it. And it's like, no, it takes me 2 seconds to look at your game and tell you it's not a publisher issue, okay? It's a product issue. Your product sucks. So I think a lot of people, they just want to shift blame because couldn't be an issue with anything that I did. Certainly not. It's definitely because of some other external factor. And I think a lot of other developers, they like the idea of having a publisher because it makes them feel like real game developers. It makes them feel like real business people. And here's the deal, man. It doesn't, okay? Just having a publisher, it doesn't really mean anything. There's lots of people that have publishers, and most of them are still unsuccessful. So getting a publisher doesn't really change your odds of anything, at least not in any really significant way. So I'm going to get into kind of a bunch of myths and random stuff that people talk about in relation to publishers and my thoughts on these things, and like ways around it. Because like a lot of people will be like, well, I need a publisher because they'll do my QA testing. Because there's no other way to do that. All right, so we'll just get into it. Okay, first thing, funding. I need a publisher because I need funding. You don't need funding. Okay, here's the deal. If you cannot figure out how to make money without money, you're going to have just as hard a time figuring out how to make money with money, okay? We're in a period in the games industry where the tools are so good, the tools are so accessible, PC publishing is so accessible that you really don't need money. You don't, as long as you have a computer, like that's really the only expense that's like required. A computer, maybe a little bit of software. I mean, for the longest time, every single piece of software that I used was free because, again, I did not have money to put into anything. So if you think that getting $100,000 so that you can hire an artist for your first project or second project is going to make a massive difference, I'm sorry to tell you, but it probably won't. Okay? If you have a bunch of money that you're going to try and put into a project to make it better, you still have to know where to allocate that money, how to use it effectively, right? You still need to understand the whole game development process at a high level if you're going to start divvying out money to specific aspects of development. Otherwise, you're just going to be like just a brand new unknowing developer, and you're just going to throw money. You're just going to be burning piles of money on random stuff that doesn't actually make a significant difference in the product. So like before you try and start funding projects, ideally you would already know how to make money even without funding. Okay, next thing that I hear all the time, and it's so ridiculous, is that you need a publisher so that you can get translations and QA testing. First of all, man, it's just, here's the deal. When a publisher is doing translations, they don't have 20 translators on staff that are like really special magical translators that only they have. What they do is they go to an existing company, a contractor that they hire, that anybody can hire. Okay, literally anybody. There are tons of these companies, translation companies, where you go to them and you say, hey, I've got a game to translate. And you give them your text and they say, cool, that'll be $5,000. That'll be $10,000, however much. And then they give you back a bunch of translations. That's what a publisher does. They take your files, they go, and they're just middlemaning it, okay? It's easy. Anybody can do this. Personally, I use Localized Direct. They've been really good to work with. I really haven't had any complaints as to like the quality of the translations. I used them for Choo Choo Charles, and I'm using them for Cuff Bust as well. And they're used by a bunch of other big companies. They translated Subway Surfers, Don't Starve. They've done some Lego games, Goat Simulator, Rocket League, Outlast. They work with a bunch of big companies, and they're good. You literally it's easy. You go to them. This isn't sponsored. I'm just saying, like, bro, like, this is not that hard. You send them like an Excel file, and then they send you back an Excel file. They automatically quote you just with all the online stuff, and it's simple. Do you need a publisher for translations? No, you don't. Well, but I don't have the money for translations. Okay, here's the deal. If you know you're going into development and you don't have money, if you go into it knowing, okay, I need to keep my costs as low as possible, if translations are going to be a problem, maybe I should just make a game that doesn't have a lot of text. Okay, don't make a visual novel. Don't make a linear story-based game. Just specifically make something that's only going to have maybe 500 words in it, right? If you've got 500 words in a game, you're probably not going to be paying more than a couple $100 per language. And then if you just translate into like the top 5 languages on Steam, that's going to get you probably 90% of the Steam user base. Just like the top 5 languages. And you can find that if you go to like the Steam, if you just go to like the Steam hardware survey, which is right in here, you can see languages. Okay, English, 33%. Simplified Chinese, 30%. Russian, 9%. Spanish, So you just go down and you do like a handful of these. Once you're getting down into like the below 1% range, it's like that's not as useful, and depending on the game, you might not need that, right? So you just translate into like 5 languages with a game that is designed to not have a ton of text, and then you're probably not spending more than like $1 or $2,000 on translations. And then this one is Localized Direct. This is the one that I use. So, yeah. Okay, and then QA testing. This is another one of these ones. People are like, oh, I need a publisher so that they can play my game. If your game sucks so bad that you can't get anybody to play it, again, you've got bigger problems than needing a publisher, okay? First step is just finding random people, everyday people, random people online. If you've got a company Discord server, have your fans test it. If you've got even a moderately decent game, even just barely scraping by, it should not be difficult to get people to test your game for you. Now, sure, are they professional vetted QA testers? No, but if you get 200 people, 200 fans to test your game, that's probably going to be just as good, if not better, than having like 2 or 3 dedicated QA people, again, from like some random contracting company. You can source testing from your followers. Again, if you're like, but I don't have followers, then you've got bigger problems. You shouldn't be worrying about a publisher. For testing on Cuffbust, I'm probably going to do, and don't you dare start emailing me asking for early access keys. I'm not going to send you one. But at some point for Cuffbust, I might do like a semi-public beta test. Either something like that, or I might try and do the same thing that I did for Choo Choo Charles. For Choo Choo Charles, I did all of my QA testing through GameTester.gg, which is this one. On this site, basically what it allows you to do is you can just give them a bunch of Steam keys. Let's say like 100 Steam keys, and then you tell them, I need a bunch of players to play through the game and then fill out this survey. And you give them a survey, and then everybody who plays the game, they sign a contract. You can have them sign an NDA as well. And they charge you, I don't know what it is. It's like $1 per tester or something like that, a couple bucks. It's very cheap. You can get a couple hundred people. I had, I think, about 250 people test Choo Choo Charles on this site. And it worked fine. They found a bunch of issues that I wouldn't have found normally, and it didn't require me to go and give up, half of my revenue to a publisher. The other big one, people say, oh, I need a publisher because they'll do all my marketing for me and they'll make my game get marketing and wish lists. They won't. I mean, technically, yes, they'll do your marketing, but your marketing, here's the deal. If you don't have a publisher right now and you're marketing your game and it's not going anywhere, odds are the issue isn't necessarily your marketing, because marketing is actually pretty simple. It's fairly straightforward in the games industry. If you're just like posting to social media, there's not really that much specific, special, hidden knowledge, okay? More likely, the issue is, again, your product. Your game looks boring. You have an unmarketable game, and no amount of publishers or funding can fix that. If you're posting to Twitter right now and you're getting 5 likes per tweet, your publisher, maybe they'll get 6. Maybe they'll get 6 likes. Ooh, big numbers. Definitely worth the 50% revenue cut there. Again, if you're having trouble marketing, you probably have bigger problems than just, oh, I need a publisher. A lot of people in the indie community, they talk about how they hate marketing. Oh, I hate marketing. It's so awful. It's like, here's the deal. Marketing isn't that bad if you have a game that's marketable. If you have a game that's marketable, it's really easy. It's not difficult. You would probably enjoy it. You probably wouldn't mind. But, it's like marketing is, the effectiveness of marketing is capped at the appeal of your product, okay? If your product is not more appealing, you're not really going to get more attention. Next thing, this isn't one that I necessarily hear people talk about a lot, but it always comes up in like the contracts. Anytime you're reading a publishing contract, you're going to see like, oh, and also we'll have the rights to make a bunch of merchandise and shirts and movies and musicals and all of that stuff. And you go, wow, they're going to make merch? Whoa, they could make movies if it does well? Here's the deal. Again, they're not going to make you merch, and they're not going to make you movies. Again, obviously, once again, the merchandise companies that your publisher will partner with are separate from themselves, okay? I don't know that there are any publishers that actually have like a specific merchandising division. There might be some that do like basic stuff, like shirts and hoodies and all that. But again, it's one of these things where if your game is doing well, you can go directly to merchandising companies that create products and stuff. You can just go straight to them. Or, again, if your game is doing really well and it's making a lot of money, they'll come straight to you. And you have to be careful with this stuff because there's a lot of the merch side of games. Well, it's not even part of the games industry. It's a whole other industry of its own. There's a lot of sketchy stuff going on over there. So it's definitely something to be very cautious with. At that point, hopefully you're making money and you can lawyer up and make sure nothing is sketchy, because everything over there is sketchy, but it's not something that you need a publisher for. And again, most likely, if your game does get to that point, they're just going to be middleman. All right, one more thing, guys. I fully edited and exported this video. I had it uploading to YouTube, and then I realized, oh my gosh, here's another goofy thing that publishers say all the time that is just ridiculous. So I got to get this one off my chest as well. This whole video is just a rant on me just slinging mud. But hey, here we go. So another one, IP ownership. Every time you talk to a publisher, every single publisher. See, this is how they used to scam you. They used to scam you by taking ownership of your IP. I wasn't around 20 years ago in the industry, but from what I've heard, that was a more common thing way back. It's where a publisher would actually get the rights to the IP. These days, they don't really do that anymore. And they always use it almost sort of like a bargaining chip. They're like, oh, don't worry, you'll maintain full IP ownership. Don't worry, you'll own your IP. But we'll get an indefinite full license to distribute and exploit the IP in any way that we see fit forever. And if you want to make a sequel, you got to come to us and we have to be the publishers for it and blah, 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 and all this stuff. So it's like, yes, technically you still own the IP, but they effectively have as much control over it as they would if they owned it. I mean, I guess there's a couple distinctions, right? Okay, they can't go and make a sequel. Well, actually, sometimes they can, even without owning the IP. But generally, they won't be able to go off and make a sequel on their own with a different studio, okay? So that's nice. And if you were to sell your IP, you could still do that. So it's one of these things where it's like, yes, the IP ownership thing, it's better for them to just have a license to basically everything. It's kind of one of these weird bargaining chips that they'll use that doesn't really mean that much. Because like people don't really buy IP. That's not really something that happens. But hey, heads up, if anybody wants to buy the Choo Choo Charles IP, hit me up. So like that's kind of like a handful of like the stuff that I hear people talking about where they're like, but I need a publisher because of fill in the blank. Well, here's the deal. Most of this stuff you don't need a publisher for. And then you're like, oh, but that's all a lot of work. It's actually not. Okay, I've done most of this stuff. The translations in QA are easy, bro. That's easy. If you can build an entire game, I promise you, you can work with a localization team and a couple of QA testers. That is the easiest part of development. Again, marketing. It doesn't need to be hard if you just make a marketable game. And we talk all about how you do that all across this channel. And as far as like, this is another thing that I should mention. As far as like the specifics of like, oh, but like, how do you do social media? Bro, just Google it. Just Google it. How to do good posts on Twitter. How to do good posts on TikTok. How does the TikTok algorithm work? This is all stuff that you can Google. This is not that complicated. Just do like a couple weeks of research and then you'll get the basics down, right? Like that's all you need. And that's all that most publishers have, okay? Most publishers don't have some insane level of knowledge that you don't. That's kind of just a good way to summarize kind of these last handful of points that I've been talking about here. It's just that a lot of developers, they get into all this stuff and they feel like there's no way that I can do all of this. Oh, this is too much. And here's the deal. Publishers are incentivized to try to make it sound as complicated as possible. You hop onto a call with a publisher, they're going to make it all sound really complicated and scary because the scarier marketing sounds, the more likely you are to try and offload that burden onto somebody else. But at the end of the day, it's all pretty accessible. It's pretty accessible. Again, excluding like stuff like console release. Console release is a pain. All right, now we're going to start getting a little bit more into just like publishers, the publishing industry, kind of just why it doesn't work and its sketchiness and weird stuff. So one of the most interesting things that I learned after announcing Choo Choo Charles that really kind of solidified a lot of my opinions on just the general indie publishing industry is when I realized that publishers don't have control over the success of a game in the way that they would like you to believe, and that they are all desperate and have been for years. They're desperate for decent games because again, they're aware of this. I think most of them are self-aware enough to realize like they don't really have control over the success of the game, so they have to find games that are that they know are going to be successful, stuff that's going viral, stuff that has a lot of wish lists, or stuff coming from developers who have previous successful games. And they all just want to publish those games, right? They're not going to publish something coming from an unknown developer or something coming from somebody who doesn't have a lot of wish lists or a lot of followers or whatever, because they know that they can't make that game a hit. They don't have that control. It's mostly based on the product itself. So if the product sucks, they don't want anything to do with it. So they're just going to try and sign the games that are already on track to becoming really successful. For Choo Choo Charles, I heard from hundreds of publishers. I was offered millions and millions of dollars worth of funding. Okay. I didn't want it because I knew if I could get it to release, it would do just fine. And I didn't need the funding, right? Like what was I going to do with it anyways? When a new game comes out that goes kind of viral or that starts getting a lot of attention, it is like throwing meat into shark infested waters. They will come for you relentlessly. They'll be popping up in your vents. They'll be peeking through your door. You'll be like going to bed at night and they start like fucking knocking on your windows like, hey, you want some money? We got some money. We could publish your game for you. They're coming down the chimney. They're everywhere. I had some of these guys that were hounding me for months, just throwing money in my face like, we have money. Give us your rev share. And it's like, no, I know that you don't, I know that you can't do anything for me. Some of these guys straight up, and keep in mind, these are not just like some random little publishers. These are the biggest publishers that have published games that you've probably played, definitely heard of, where like I would hop on calls with them and never really with the intention of actually publishing with them. Sometimes I would hop on call with them to see if I could get loans from them because I did want a little bit of funding for Choo Choo Charles because I knew that I wanted to have it translated and have like voice acting and stuff, which was going to cost me a little bit. So I started talking with some of these people to see if there was any kind of unconventional deal that they might be willing to do. And I'd hop on call with some of these big publishers and they'd be like, yeah, you know, your virality, your YouTube channel and like all the marketing, man, the number of wish lists you've got is really incredible. Honestly, man, we couldn't have done better ourselves. And it's like, okay, so you're probably trying to go for like some sort of like a flattery sales tactic, but also I don't think you meant to say that. Because then in the next sentence, they're like, so you're going to give us 50% of your revenue, right? Like literally, and this is multiple times, multiple publishers were just like, yeah, I mean, I think the best performance that we've had on a launch was about X numbers. And I'm doing significantly more. And they're like, yeah, so also give us your money. No, I would rather not. So they're not capable of making a game into a massive hit. They know that they're not capable of making a game into a massive hit. They are desperate for decent games to publish that they can get their hands on. And there aren't that many massive indie games that come along. There's very, very few. So developers have way, way, way more control than they realize. A lot of developers, they look up to publishers, these big, massive corporations. And they're like, wow, they must know some really special stuff. They don't. They got lucky 20 years ago with a handful of really big games, and they've just been burning money since. I mean, pretty much all of them have horrific success rates. Most of these publishers are literally being funded by like 1 or 2 games. If you go on Steam, I'm not going to pull up examples because, again, it's literally just go to any publisher page on Steam. If you look at the review counts on their games, go down their whole catalog, see how many of these games were actually hits. Okay, how many of these games are making, because again, if we're talking about like these like big publisher published games, like you got to be making over 7 figures if you're like going to be like really profitable. Like assuming you had a game that was funded for a couple $100,000 and it's on Steam and you got the Steam cut to factor in and you had a couple years of development time and all that stuff, you got to be making like over $1 million to be like even like to be making like an above average wage for at least like if you're in America. Pretty much all of them, you're going to see like maybe 1 out of 10 games are like doing like pretty solid. This kind of gets into where the whole indie publishing business model is just kind of flawed, right? If you're going to be offering a valuable service, you have to actually be offering value for your service. And as we've discussed, There's not a lot of things that these indie publishers are doing that you can't do. It's mostly just stuff that people think they can't do or that they don't want to do, but absolutely could if they put in like an extra month's worth of work. Let's say a month. You dedicated a month to learning the basics of social media marketing and the basics of this or that, or finding your own translation team. What's going to allow a publisher to effectively market a game is the product. If you just have a good product and you understand the general marketing tips and stuff, then you can get around that just fine. If you understand that, like, okay, I don't have a massive budget, so I'm going to design a game that doesn't require much budget, then you can get around that. You know, and this is a topic that, like, hopefully by now, if you've been following along with this channel for like most of these videos, you'll have seen how, like, I kind of keep on talking about how, like, the game, I've said it so many times in this video because it's important, okay? The product is what's going to actually make you money. If it's designed in such a way that it is inherently going to get people's attention and convert that attention into action, it'll make way more money, right? And a publisher does not have control over that. The publisher has control over the spark, right? They can control how big the boulder is before you roll it down the hill, right? Bigger the boulder, the farther it rolls, right? That's your general pre-launch marketing. But again, if you have a marketable game, that marketing process shouldn't be that difficult. If you've got a decent demo that you put out on a Steam Next Fest and you can get some attention there, if you can get some YouTubers to cover your game pre-launch, a lot of this stuff is not that complicated. So essentially every single service that publishers offer isn't really as valuable as they would like you to think it is. That's the whole summary. And of course, also can't ignore the numerous examples. I'm not going to say that, like, this, obviously it's not every publisher, and I would hope that this kind of stuff is rare, but there are way more examples of people getting scammed through publishing companies than pretty much in any other way in the games industry. There are numerous examples of people being scammed or bad deals, and it goes a lot farther than that. The rabbit hole goes deep, okay? Obviously, I think we all have heard, you know, the people on like r/gamedev who are like, oh no, I signed a moderately bad deal with a publisher because I didn't read the contract. But there's like straight up fraud in certain cases. I'm not even talking about like these random publishers. Like, there are large publishers, reputable publishers. I mean, hey, maybe they've got something in the contract where they're getting away with it legally, technically, right? But like fraud for like millions of dollars. Obviously not naming specific examples, because the last thing that I want to do is get caught in the middle of some random lawsuit. That doesn't sound fun. You know, I mean, hey, at the end of the day, right? I mean, who's to say that's even real, right? I mean, we're just telling spooky campfire stories here, right? This stuff doesn't actually happen. So it's like, the whole thing is just a minefield. There's sketchy stuff. There's a lot of incompetence. There's a lot of people saying they can do things that they really can't. And I suppose I should also note, right, that like, it's not like I think every publisher is morally corrupt. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. There are plenty of publishers that they're perfectly fine people. I'm not trying to demonize or anything like that. But even if you have a publisher that's morally great, they're perfectly nice people, they're great to work with, they're as helpful as they can be, the business model itself is still just fundamentally flawed. It just doesn't really work. Even if they have the best of intentions, there's very little that they can actually do. You know, ultimately, like, if you're getting lots of emails and messages from publishers that want to work with you, just take it as a little gold star, okay? Don't say, oh my gosh, the publishers think, they're saying that I could make a lot of money if I sign with them. Maybe I should sign with them. No, just say, okay, if a publisher is hitting you up, then they probably think that you're going to make money. If a lot of people think that you're going to make money, then it's like, okay, cool. These people think that I'm going to make money. Now I'm just going to go and do that, okay? You don't need their help. They already think that you're on track to earning a lot off your game. Just take it as a gold star. Don't take it too seriously, because remember, they also have really bad success rates, so it might not mean anything at all. But just take it as a compliment and just keep going. You know, another one that's really common is influencer outreach and like press releases. And they'll be like, oh yeah, we'll do a press release for you. We've got this whole list of people who have covered our other games. It's like, yeah, because the other games that they published were like from some massive IP or whatever it might be, right? Like, again, it's based on the product. Like, people are going to write press and articles about your game if the game is press worthy. Okay, if you don't have a press worthy game, it's like, yeah, maybe they'll send out 300 emails to their spam list that they've gotten an Excel sheet, but the conversion rate on that's probably going to be awful. Sure, they're like, oh yeah, Markiplier played one of our games last year. Like, okay, like, these publishers, they don't have a direct line of contact. They're not like calling up PewDiePie on his cell and they're like, hey, we got a new game for you to play. And he's like, oh my gosh, yes, I need to play this. They don't have that level of influence. There might be a handful of these publishers that do have like specific brand ambassadors, let's say, that do pretty much play all of their games. But you're talking maybe like 5 YouTubers, 5 mid to small channels. And it's like, that's not worth half of your revenue, okay? Those channels are going to pull in, maybe 3, 4, 5 million views total. That's going to generate you maybe a whopping total of like an extra $300 in revenue, okay? YouTube videos don't convert very well, right? If you actually want to make a lot of money off of YouTube and streaming marketing, you have to be pulling hundreds of millions to billions of views. And the handful of brand ambassadors that some of these companies will tout as being like their big secret weapon are worthless. So that's kind of it. That's the main thing. Here's the deal. If you've been making games for 20 years and you've made multiple successful games and you're watching this and you're like, actually, for XYZ reason, I specifically know that I need a publisher. Here's the deal. There are scenarios where somebody knows that they need a publisher. Great. If you're one of those people, fantastic. But most of the people that think they need a publisher are new to this. They haven't been doing this for very long. They don't have any successful games under their belt. They don't know how to spend funding. They wouldn't know how to spend funding if they did have it. They're signing away all the money that is going to get recouped if the game does blow up. That's the other thing, right? If you already have, like, if you've got 100,000 wish lists and you're one of these people that's getting hounded by publishers, bro, you're already good. You're chilling. Don't try as hard as you can to avoid getting publishers involved, because once you release that, you're going to make money. Okay? Ideally, you can keep as many hands off of that as possible. I don't know. That's it. Just wanted to talk about it because I felt like saying something that people disagree with.